All right, well, good morning or afternoon. My name is Greg Yungbluth. I'm here with Andrew Patizzi, and Andrew has invited me to talk a little bit about the early history of St. Benedict's parish. Now, I've been a member of the parish all my life, but I'm not 100 years old, so I wasn't around when the parish started. Most of our parishioners, I'm sure, know that the year 2020, last year, was to have been our centennial celebration year because it was last year that we were 100 years old. But a virus happened and that kind of fell off the rails. So the events that we hoped to hold last year really didn't happen. And we still don't want to leave our early history forgotten. So that's why I'm speaking this morning. Because I wasn't around in 1920, which was the year of the founding of our parish, I would have had to do an awful lot of research to talk about the early years of our parish, but that problem was solved for me by a woman whom I've never met and don't know much about, but her name was Sister Mary Hilda. She was a member of the Franciscan order, the Order of St. Francis of Penance and Christian Charity. And I'm guessing that in 1954, Sister Mary Hilda was probably a very young nun because she was, in those days, working on her graduate degree at Canisius College. She was pursuing her Master's of Education degree, and one of the requirements for that degree was that she prepare a thesis, a master's thesis. And she, perhaps because she was assigned to our school, St. Benedict's, or one of the other schools out in this area, she chose the history and development of St. Benedict's Parish and St. Benedict's School as the topic of her thesis. And so, when I talk to you about those early years, understand that I'm borrowing from her thesis paper written in 1954. We can assume that she went on to get her master's degree. Now, I said I assumed she was a young sister in those days because she was still pursuing her own education. When I was a child in St. Benedict's School, we thought all the nuns were at least 80 years old, but I'm guessing she was a bit younger than that at the time. So, 1920, what was happening in the world and in our country, and less so in Buffalo and Eggertsville in 1920? Well, let's try to put ourselves back into that period of history. We were only 2 years past the end of World War I, the war that was hoped to end all wars, the Great War as they called it. So the world and our country was really kind of in a period of recovery. Another thing we were all recovering from was the Spanish flu, the pandemic of 100 years ago. It had consumed the world for about 2 years. It was thought to have ended, and I guess ended in 1920 after having infected 500 million people worldwide. Now that was, at the time, a third of the entire world's population. So we're very familiar now with our own pandemic, but certainly that pandemic was every bit as much devastating as is our own. So we were coming out of a war, the war years. We were coming out of a pandemic, thank God. Something very significant also happened in 1920, and that was the final ratification by the states of the 18th Amendment of our Constitution. A very controversial amendment that prohibited the sale of alcohol and started for us the age of prohibition. And with it, as we marked what also became known as the start of the Roaring Twenties, we became, I wasn't here to say again, but the people of those years became familiar with things like speakeasies and bootleggers and the birth of the blues and jazz and ragtime. And the women, some of them became known as flappers as they danced. And a lot of people during that decade danced the Charleston. So that was part of the flavor of those times. Interestingly, but we'll come back to this, the Pope who presided in Rome in those days was Pope Benedict XV. And I think that had some influence on the name of our parish. Other things to be noted perhaps about 1920. It was, on the one hand, coming out of the end of the war and the Treaty of Versailles, it was the birth of the League of Nations. Our President Woodrow Wilson had been our wartime president, and he was very instrumental in helping create and promote the League of Nations, the purpose of which was to hopefully create a forum for the resolution of differences among nations and prevent another world war from ever happening. Ironically, in 1920, in Munich, Germany, the country that was the loser of World War I and the subject of many repressive measures in the Treaty of Versailles, there was a new political party that began in Munich in 1920, came to be known as the Nazi Party. So as the League of Nations is created on the one hand to help provide for a lasting peace, the seeds of what became the Second World War were also born. In endeavors here at home in the United States in sports, 1920 was the year the National Football League was born in Canton, Ohio. Babe Ruth was traded by the Boston Red Sox to the New York Yankees, and in 1920 rewarded the Yankees by being the first Major League Baseball player to hit 50 home runs in a season. And in fact, he ended the year by hitting 54. Even though, despite his efforts, it was the Cleveland Indians that won the 17th World Series in 1920. Jack Dempsey won the World Heavyweight Boxing Championship that year, and the horse of the year was Man of War. Didn't win the Triple Crown because he didn't win the Kentucky Derby, but he did win the Preakness and the Belmont, and late in the year he won another race at Belmont Park by 100 lengths. Pretty good. My notes remind me that Bob Hope became a U.S. citizen in 1920, and Enrico Caruso gave his last public concert. So that's what was happening in the world in 1920. Some other fast facts that I found interesting. Cars had been around for a number of years, of course, but in most cities, the speed limit was still only 10 miles an hour. And you didn't buy fuel for your cars at a gas station. There were no gas stations. You bought your fuel at the drugstore. Only 14% of homes had a bathtub, and only 8% had a telephone. The average wage in 1920 was 22 cents an hour. And the average income for a worker in 1920 was between $200 and $400 a year. The population of Las Vegas was only 30. 95% of all births took place at home. 20% of U.S. adults couldn't read or write, and only 6% of Americans graduated from high school. So that's what life was like back in 1920.